PANS, PANDAS, ADHD, mood issues. How do you really know what's causing your child's symptoms? Hi, I'm Dr. Roseann, and I make calming dysregulation easy. And today we're talking about, is it PANS, PANDAS, or ADHD, a mood disorder, or 14 million other things? Because it can be super confusing. And we're going to dive into what are the shared symptoms, how is these clinical conditions different, and of course, what you should do about it. So, first of all, misdiagnosis is common because of these overlapping symptoms and because clinical conditions can actually co occur. It's really important to pinpoint what is really going on because you're not going to get proper help unless you pinpoint what is actually happening. That's what we talk a lot about, root causes. So, what's really driving that inattention or that aggression? And that's what we're going to talk about, right? So, number one, why do symptoms actually overlap? So, these clinical issues, PANS, PANDAS, ADHD, mood issues, they have shared brain regions that get affected, right? So the same parts of the brain that, control attention, executive functioning, emotional regulation, behavioral control, impulse control, often get affected in all three of these clinical issues. So it's natural for people to go and get help and say, well, my kid can't pay attention. They used to be able to pay attention, but now they really can't. Or all of a sudden they're moody, and then you get help. And on the surface, right, the behavioral expression of these clinical issues on the surface look the same, but we know that the sources are different, right? So you have biology, genetics, you have, diet, nutrition, you have infections and toxins in the case of PANS and PANDAS. They do impact the brain regions, but in different ways, right? So with PANS and PANDAS, we know it's neuroinflammation, right? So co-occurrence. So it's very common today, not when I started 30 years ago, right? With changing, epigenetic components, right? That we have a lot of genetic variants happening. Diet has changed, stress levels up, expectations for children in their schoolwork and what they should be doing at home have dramatically increased. Kids today have a lot of diagnoses. I often refer to, when people come to me, I call these shopping cart diagnoses where people have like multiple things. And sometimes it's legit, but a lot of times PANS PANDAS can be part of that, right? The other reason why it can be confusing is parent perception, right? So parents, you don't know what you don't know. And so you go searching the internet, you go looking for guidance, and you're just not getting proper guidance as to the underlying reasons, those root causes as to what's going on. It's probably why you're here. What I always say to people, if your child's diagnosis doesn't fit and they do have shopping cart diagnoses, it's time to look a little closer at PANS and PANDAS, right? So let's dive into the overlapping symptoms between these three issues, because these are the three ones that, not that there's not a million others, but these are the three ones that I consistently hear that these symptoms related to, ADHD, mood disorder, and PANS and PANDAS, there's an overlap, right? So inattention and focus, right, is pretty common. I talk a lot about adults. It's almost like a cool thing to have an ADD diagnosis, and there's lots in the influencer world talking about it. And not to make light of it, nobody, we're all wired uniquely, right? And everyone has different ways that they work and they live. And my goal is always for people to regulate their nervous system, regardless if you have a clinical issue or not. You need to do that for good mental health and physical wellness, right? So when it comes to inattention, what happens with kids with PANS and PANDAS, right? What drives that? Well, it's flares and illness, right? With ADHD, there's a constant difficulty there. And with mood issues, it's related to their emotional state. I hope that helps you to distinguish, right? When it comes to emotional dysregulation, right, PANS, PANDAS, it's related to that immune response, right? Sometimes there are these micro flares where kids have a little bit of a destabilization, or there's huge flares. We know they had an illness. I spend so much time with the families I work with, trying to figure out what's actually happening with their flares. And then in ADHD, there can be a lot of triggers for emotional dysregulation. I do find that a lot of it is the impulse control, the lack of coping skills, and just a poor distress tolerance. I think that happens a lot in a lot of conditions. And with mood, you see a constant with emotional dysregulation. There is a very low frustration tolerance. There's a lack of perception as to their role or others. There's a lot of that rejection sensitivity where they believe they're being persecuted. You see that a lot in there. So anxiety. So these three clinical issues, anxiety is almost always present. And particularly with mood disorder, it doesn't get talked enough about, but anxiety is a big trigger. And what you can see is with somebody with a mood disorder is a chronic negative thought pattern can be a trigger for worry, for that emotional dysregulation, for that inattentive. People with mood disorders in general tend to be a glass half empty. And so there is a constant negativity, right? Parents will tell me, like, my gosh, I spent an hour arguing with him with his homework when could have taken 10 minutes, right? Those are the kind of things, right? That negativity. With ADHD, you might see anxiety related to school performance, doing tasks that they don't want to do, and is certainly related to executive functioning and having poor executive functioning. You might see a lot of times my kids with ADHD will have like a nervousness. They're going to forget something. And so they impulsively tell you. You also see that with learning disabled kids because they want to do the right thing. With PANS and PANDAS, anxiety can be sudden. It should be sudden in the onset. You see an increase with those flares. And anxiety and OCD are separate. They are separate clinical conditions, but they're very interrelated. OCD is you develop what we call maladaptive coping ways to deal with stress, right? Now, with PANS and PANDAS, it's a sudden onset or an exacerbation and a steep exacerbation of a pre-existing condition, right? So another common behavior that we see is irritability and aggression. And they're not uncommon in ADD, PANS, PANDAS, and mood disorders. And so with PANS and PANDAS, you're going to see that sudden onset. These are behaviors that typically weren't there. They also can come out of nowhere. There's no connection to what actually happened. With ADHD, I see it most likely when told no and when they're frustrated. Most commonly. Also, if I have whole entire families of low frustration tolerance, ADDers, you see it repeating itself because that's a learned behavior. And with mood, you see persistent, negative talk, aggressive speak. It's there. It also can be more present in people with mood disorders who start showing signs of mania. Kids with disruptive mood disorder or bipolar, when bipolar starts with kids, they don't have to be rapid cyclers in the same way. There's a low level of cycling. And so you can see these micro pop-ups of very low moods or very high moods. And sometimes it's just missed, right? But it's much more constant, these behaviors, regardless of what the main behavior is in ADHD and mood disorder. Sleep disturbance. So with PANS and PANDAS, all of these, anxiety is a trigger for sleep disturbance, but you'll see it much more with related to OCD. You can have a lot of rituals that are preventing your child from going to sleep. So you want to be careful about that. And with ADHD, it's anxiety. It also is hyperactivity. So, they're just real hyper and they can't wind down. And, these are kids that are running around if hyperactivity is a part of it, right? When sleep is affected in their mood cycle, right? So it could be that they have a hard time getting to sleep if they're in an up cycle, or they just can't wake up when there is mood. So there's some definite differences. Obviously, in the onset is a huge time of difference. PANS PANDAS is a sudden dramatic onset. ADHD, what you're seeing is sort of gradual, right? Depending on the demands, you start really seeing the changes. And when it comes to mood, it occurs over time and it really can really accelerate during puberty. You also can really see the tide with mood due to the demands, right? Individuals for different reasons, kids with ADHD have a low frustration tolerance because they tend to be more impulsive, they lack executive functioning, they don't see end results, and kids with mood issues literally are irritated by it. And I do see people with mood issues being labeled almost all the time with ADHD first. When I do these brain maps, you're not always able to see it. And if you're interested in a brain map or want to work with us in some capacity, we have so many different cool solutions. You can go to drroseann.com/help, and you're going to take a solution matcher and it's going to guide you to exactly where you need to be. And we have amazing solutions that I feel really proud that we created, from groups to easy to use, quick resources to working one-on-one. We only work with about 5 or 6 people a month, and we work with them one-on-one. And people fly in, they get a brain map, they get to meet with me, and then we have you in a program that's 6 months, includes neurofeedback and nutrition, a lot of cool stuff. I'm really into genetics because we need to look at it, right? So key differences, right, are triggers. So PANS and PANDAS, infections and toxins, ADHD, right? Behavioral triggers, frustration, school, asking them to complete tasks that their brain doesn't like. You also see in ADHD, forgot to say this, like they're gifted in areas they enjoy. And the house could be burning down and they'll still be doing amazing on a task. So you see that hyper fixation, over focusing in areas where they love to do things. You always pray that it's like in something that will serve them. And I do believe no matter what area of fixation, you can turn it around and make it that really will serve them later in life. I have seen that happen time and time again. There's an episode with Gabe and Hannah, and she really found his interest, and it didn't feel like it was ever going to work out. But now you got to hear years later how it did and how he's really thriving and successful. In terms of mood, right, triggers can be just everyday life. Like things don't work out, feel very criticized is a common trigger. The mood cycle is a factor in that, so the up and down. But I do feel that often kids with a mood disorder, there's a constant negativity, negative speak, a pushback that's there, where when it comes to PANS and PANDAS, you're going through flares, you're going through ups and downs, right? And what can you do as a parent? This is most important. Number one, you want to track patterns. Get out your phone, start tracking. Oh, okay, well, he had a cold, he got through it okay, and now he's yelling at me and punching holes in the wall. Okay, right? And that happened before, right? Or every time I ask him to do a chore, he's angry. Or this is the second semester of school and he falls apart every year. You really want to start putting your detective hat on and thinking these things through. And I promise you, unless you have an amazing provider, somebody like Dr. Rowe, these providers don't put the pieces together, and they're very often present and they just don't have the clinical experience to make sense of these things. I mean, I spent so many years doing neuropsych testing, being in schools, having complex cases. I've only had complex cases. So if you have a complex issue, it feels pretty easy to me to kind of sort it out. But the reality is that many people have layers, and that's why misdiagnosis is really a common thing, right? You want to focus on what are the triggers, what are the root causes, and really get expert care. And you can go to drroseann.com/help to get that expert care. Mood swings aren't always mood disorders. And if you have a kid who's emotionally dysregulating and it's happening a lot, it's new, you really want to consider PANS and PANDAS and think this through, because again, it's treatable. Not that any of these conditions aren't treatable, but getting to the root cause is critical, and that is your next best step. So go over to drroseann.com/help, and I can help guide you in the right direction, the right solution for you.